This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello, and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. Today I'm happy to say we have as our guest Rob Gordon, who is the Minor League Baseball Analyst for BaseballHQ.com. How are you today, Rob?
Good. Thanks, Jeff, for having me on the show.
One of the projects you always work on every year is your minor league book, and you were saying that you just put the thing to bed, pretty much.
Yeah, we were kind of running up against the deadline and just finally got it out yesterday to the printer. So I think it'll be coming out available at the end of January. And we put a lot of work into it. I think we cover over 1,000 players, maybe close to 1,200 players this year. So it's a useful tool, especially for those competing in deep dynasty keeper leagues, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the amount of information on minor leaguers these days, it used to be if you knew the top 3 prospects, you were ahead of the curve, and now it's, you almost, there are people that know the rosters for every single A team.
Right.
Yeah, so you guys, you do the same thing with the minor leaguers that Baseball HQ has done with major leaguers for 25 years. It's kind of an in-depth sabermetric study of what you think they're going to do.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. So we look at the stats, just like, HQ, and use all the same metrics and everything, but then also provide a scouting report too. So it's kind of a nice mix of the actual scouting reports, but also kind of with a focus towards fantasy baseball. And so, unlike some other organizations out there that do one thing or the other, we really tried to blend those two things together.
Yeah, well, Baseball HQ has been something I've recommended for score sheet people forever, because one of the things you guys do is say what players are going to do in real life, which is what translates the best to score sheets, since
right.
We don't have dollar values for stolen bases and saves and runs scored. So, OPS and, projected OPS and projected ERA are what our guys want.
Right, and it's always kind of tricky, because if you're projecting for those kinds of things, you think about this guy, Mallet Smith, who just got traded to the Braves. I mean, he stole a bunch of bases, but if that's, other than that, he wouldn't really be a great fantasy player or even a great, major league player. It's just that he's got tons of speed. So it's always tricky when you're trying to, to pitch it for a certain audiences, when in the back of your mind, like, best case scenario is this guy's the next Tony Womack, but in real life, I don't know how much value that has,
Yeah, I mean, I remember last year, Billy Hamilton was the talk of every rotisserie advice site, because somebody, people were talking, he might steal 100, 120, 140 bases.
Right.
And I'm like, well, that may be, but if he's a starting center fielder and his on-base percentage is 270, I don't know how much in real life that's going to help the Cincinnati Reds.
No, and it turns out that was definitely an issue and a concern. Speed guys like that are always, I hate evaluating those guys, because you really, in real life, in a score sheet, you're kind of looking at that and saying, well, that guy's not going to have nearly as much value, because he's got tons of speed, but he can't steal first base,
That has always been the saying. You can't steal first base.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think the Reds, the difference between Shin-Soo Choo, who had that on base of about 400 for the Reds in 2013, and then Hamilton in 2014 with like 120 points lower, that's an awful lot of guys not on base, or times there's no one on base when you got Votto and people like that coming up.
Yeah, and I think it really hurt them.
Yeah, they didn't make the playoffs, for instance, so that was bad. So, I mean, the minor league thing's always a little tricky, because you have the whole league concept. I know there are leagues in the minor leagues that are really pitching friendly, and other leagues that are really hitter friendly.
Yeah, and that's always tricky trying to assess that. But one of the sections that we include in the book is the minor league equivalencies, and so that does neutralize for park effects. So that's sort of in the back in the glossary section of the book. But that's one way to kind of take that into consideration.
So when you do your minor league equivalencies for your projections, if a guy had an OPS of 750 in the California League, that's going to translate differently than if he had a 750 in some league back east.
Yeah, like Florida State League or something like that, or even the Midwest League, which is always a notoriously pitcher-friendly league.
Right.
So absolutely, yeah, we definitely take those kinds of things into consideration.
Huh. Yeah, that's the kind of thing where I like reading your book, because if it's one thing for me to try to decide what Jay Bruce is going to do next year, because I can look at 3 years of Major League numbers. But trying to know what some guy out of the Midwest League compared to a guy out of the Pacific Coast League, for me, is a bit of a challenge.
No, and the guy that I always like to think back about is Andrew McCutcheon. As a minor leaguer, he never really put up fantastic numbers, but he always kind of played above his age level, and was played in a lot of the pitcher-friendly leagues, and so people started to sour on him when he never had that true monster breakout season. But, he didn't play in the Cal, so he didn't have the opportunity to put up some of those gaudy numbers that some of the players do.
I think that's true. People come out. Well, didn't Albert Pujols kind of come out of nowhere when he first made the majors?
Yeah.
And, but still, the minor league equivalent, like I said, if somebody uses your stuff where you guys take a lot of that into account, then these guys aren't nearly the surprise that they are to, someone who just, like you said, is kind of looking for the guy that had 40 homers in the minors.
Right. Yep. No, every year there's somebody at, either in the Cal League or, at AAA who, hits 35 home runs, and, people are saying, well, who is this guy? And, I think if you really understand what's going on, you realize having power, either because you're older than the competition or because it's a hitter-friendly league, you really have to look at some other metrics and figure out what exactly is going on.
Right. Well, and you mentioned age, too. I mean, once in a while a guy will be 24 years old playing in low A.
Yeah.
And, it's almost like if you're 24 in low A and you're an outfielder and you're not hitting 35 home runs, then you're probably not much of a player.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think it's all context, especially in the minors. So do you have a couple minor leaguer guys now that you've kind of done the book that really jumped out maybe as someone you'd want to target in a fantasy draft?
Sure. You're thinking more like short-term, somebody that might have an impact in 2015, say?
Well, maybe a guy in 20. We've got a mix of people in score sheets. Some play in single seasons, so they obviously don't care about 2016. But
right.
I think in score sheet, we're probably up to 2/3 of our folks play keeper league. So, everybody kind of wants a guy that'll come up this year. But, if he's going to be good in 2 years, you think that's a value to 2/3 of our guys.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so obviously some of the guys I think are going to break out, and obviously I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about somebody like Chris Bryant from the Cubs, who probably everybody has heard of, and he had just an amazing year last year and probably come out the season as the Cubs starting third baseman. But that guy's not going to be a surprise, and so somebody like Robbie Erlin is a guy I really like, and he's always had fantastic stuff for the Padres, and he had some injury issues last year, but I really think somebody like that is going to be a real valuable pitcher just because he throws tons of strikes and doesn't walk anybody. Some other pitchers, Andrew Heaney just got traded to the Angels. I don't know where he's going to get a chance or when he's going to get a chance to pitch for them, but I always liked him. He's got good stuff, left-hander, knows how to get hitters out, real savvy pitcher. Pitchers, it seems to me they have an easier time breaking in. They're not necessarily going to be better right off the bat, but everybody needs pitching. And so really looking at, if you're trying to target somebody who's going to maybe be a little bit of a surprise for 2015, looking at some pitchers is a good place to do that. Another guy who I like is Aaron Nola of the Phillies. He was their first-round pick out of LSU last year. He's always had really good stuff. I think kind of gets undervalued maybe in the scouting community just because he's not one of these 6'5", 240-pound guys, and so he's a bit smaller, but a real good strike thrower, knows how to pitch, and pitched at a very competitive program. By the middle of the season, I would be surprised if he isn't in the Phillies starting rotation, especially since they're in kind of rebuilding mode at this point.
Your comment about pitchers, it's true that even if they seem to be blocked in March, by May or June, there just almost is never a major league pitching staff that doesn't need to call up some players from the minor leagues.
Right.
Where, if you're a third baseman, all you need is their starting third baseman to stay healthy, and you're kind of blocked all year. But as a pitcher, you're going to get a shot if you're good enough to need a shot.
Like the guy Alex Guerrero from the Dodgers, the Cuban player that they signed last year, who got his ear bitten off. He had a really good year last year, but the Dodgers traded for Howie Kendrick, and so I don't know what they're going to do with him. I guess he could maybe be a super utility player, but it's hard to sort of project him having a lot of full-time action in 2015 or even 2016. They have major league talent pretty much at every position. Versus, somebody that, like the Cardinals, Marco Gonzalez and Alex Reyes, who, two younger pitchers who right now don't really have a clear spot in the rotation, but I'd rather take a chance on one of those guys getting an opportunity sometime mid-season just because, inevitably you're going to go through injuries with your pitching staff.
Yeah, they're going to get a shot. So that old saying of there's no such thing as a pitching prospector, maybe not such an old saying, but it goes around. That's maybe more true in the lower levels, right? If a guy's been in the minors for a few years and shown good command and all, and he's going to make the majors this year, then they're fairly projectable, don't you think?
The caveat, obviously, is just the injury history, and the likelihood that they're going to miss a significant amount of time. And so I'm a huge buy low on pitching prospects, but I like them a lot because I do think you can tend to get those guys relatively cheap. And every year you see guys that come out of nowhere Jake DeGrom last year, I mean, I don't think anybody drafted that guy from the Mets. At least they didn't pay a lot of money for him if they did. And yet he was one of the better, pitchers in the National League. And so, especially if you're willing to sort of carry a little bit of risk there, I think you can get some real good values. Whereas, if you go to try to draft, say, Jock Peterson of the Dodgers, who looks like he's going to maybe have a chance to win their starting center field job, you're going to end up paying a lot of money for that guy. And any minor league player is going to be a risky proposition going forward. You just don't know what you're going to get. If you're paying, $15 for an unproven center fielder versus a couple of dollars for a guy who doesn't necessarily have a clear shot at a spot in the rotation but might have good stuff, I'd take the chance on the pitchers.
No, you're right, because the hitting prospects, they get an incredible amount of hype. I think, Bryce Harper, for instance, we mentioned age earlier. You can actually find people now that are already starting to call him a bust, which is, what is he, like 22 years old? I mean,
22, yeah.
Yeah, so I think calling him a bust, if you're 22 and you're in the major leagues at all, you're pretty phenomenal.
Well, I know, and everybody's talking about Chris Bryant from the Cubs, I mentioned earlier. He's 24. So, and he hasn't played a game in the majors yet. So there's a lot of hype, but I also think you have to be patient with those kind of guys.
Yeah, no, and the age thing, you're right, 24. He'll probably be good. I mean, everybody would like to have Chris Bryant now, and I think he looks good enough that his risk is fairly low for a guy who's never been in the majors. But, yeah, you got to look at, Bryce Harper, they're honestly, I know down at the Fall League this year in November, people were talking like, oh, he's falling down. He's just another outfielder. I'm like, he's 22. He's,
right.
He could make the All-Star team this year. Wouldn't really shock me anyhow, and he'd be 22, 23-year-old All-Star.
He has the potential, if he kind of can figure a couple things out, to hit 40 home runs. I mean, I still think that power potential is there. If he has an injury-free season and makes a few adjustments at the plate, I still think that power is there.
Yeah. Well, and other guys, we're kind of leaving the minor leagues a little bit behind, but like Will Myers.
Yeah.
He had one pretty not very great season last year, but there's an awful lot of young guys who are in their second or third year in the majors have a down year and bounce back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look at Alex Gordon. It took him probably 3 or 4 years to figure things out. But, once he did, he turned into a pretty good ball player.
Yeah. No, I've been guilty of the opposite. Sometimes I hold on to the Sean Burrows of the world for 5 years too long, and eventually when they're like 30, and you go, okay, he's 30. I better give up.
Yeah.
That center, Jack Peterson, or however you pronounce him, for the Dodgers, he seems a little, I'm a Giants fan, so I don't like the Dodgers, I guess, but he seems a little riskier to me than some people are making him out to be.
You got to remember, what's a typical Rookie of the Year stat line? It's going to be like, 270 with maybe a 320, 330 on-base percentage and 20 home runs. A lot of years, that's going to win you the Rookie of the Year. Right, that's a good rookie year. And so I think with Peterson, he strikes out a ton. He does walk a lot, but you got to wonder if some of that isn't a factor of, the fact that he's at AAA, and so, he was clearly the best player on the team. And you get a lot of journeyman pitchers at AAA. They're probably just like, I'm not going to face this guy. I'm just going to take whoever the next, the fifth guy in the lineup is. Who knows who that is, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not really clear to me that plate discipline is going to translate automatically to the majors. I do think he's got a good eye at the plate, but there's also a lot of swing and miss there. He does have nice speed, and I could see him having, potentially having a 2020 season, but he might hit 230.
Yeah, though these days in center field, defense I think is getting a little more play in the major leagues.
Yeah.
So if he plays a good center field, I think teams are willing to kind of have a weaker hitter in center, just like forever they've been willing to have a weaker hitter at shortstop.
Yeah. But you also have to look at the Dodgers. They're going to be in playoff contention, presumably. How patient are they going to be with the... we've seen that before where a guy gets 100 at-bats and struggles a little bit, and then... Well, Colton Wong was a good example of that. He came up initially and struggled and kind of got sat down, and then, by the end of the year, he turned into a pretty good ball player. But, again, rookie hitters, I think, are a risky proposition, I think, inherently.
Well, especially, as you said, if you're trying to make the playoffs, there's some pressure. And the press gets on you, the fans get on you, and if you've got a manager who's maybe feeling a little bit of heat, I think Mattingly, if they don't do well in the playoffs this year, it's hard to imagine the Dodgers keeping him. So I don't see him as a manager this year that can afford to just stick with a guy. They still have plenty of offers.
Yeah, and I think you just have to, as a result, you have to kind of watch the situation carefully. And the Cubs when they bring the guys up. I mean, Javier Baez stunk up. He hit a bunch of home runs, but he struck out like at an alarming rate. But they're going to let him learn on the job, or at least give him a good 300 or 400 at bats next year.
Right.
Same with Chris Bryant when they call him up, or Soler, or any of these other guys that they call up, just because they're in rebuilding mode. But I think that's something that you have to take into consideration. Like, what's the team doing? Somebody like Michael Franco from the Phillies, the third base prospect. I mean, he's presumably going to have a fairly long leash because the Phillies aren't going anywhere.
Now, the Cubs actually could be a surprise. I think a lot of people think there's a chance they actually contend, especially now that they've signed some pitching. But yeah, the Phillies, if they win 70 games, I'll be surprised. So,
right.
Yeah, you would think that anybody young on the Phillies is going to pretty much get to play.
Yeah, so that's why, Aaron Nola, the pitcher, and then Michael Franco, the third baseman, who kind of struggled a little bit last year, but I still really like long term. I think those guys are worth rostering, just because I also think you're not going to have to spend as much money on a player like that as you would on a Chris Bryant or a Jock Peterson.
That's true. Well, if you want to read more in depth on, like Rob said, 1,200 minor league players, or of course the website baseballhq.com is always updating major leaguer and minor leaguers. Check out the book. They sell it on the website. One benefit of buying there is you get things like electronic updates sent to you. I think there's a PDF you get access to in March. So check it out, buy it from the site, and you'll get all the updates as they come out.
Yep.
That sounds good. Well, good talking to you, and hopefully the Dodgers will fall flat on their face. That'd make me happy.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right. Talk to you later.